In July of 1978, on the quiet streets of Buffalo, New York, a mother's descent into darkness led to a chilling tale of murder and an alleged voodoo curse. This video contains graphic details about dismemberment, children, and sensitive issues that may be distressing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. This is the true story of Gail Trait, the mother who would shock a community with her unspeakable actions. In the heart of Buffalo's Eastside, a seemingly ordinary woman, Gail Trait, lived a quiet life. Neighbors described her as a regular, polite, and average woman. Born in Buffalo, New York, Gail had lived on Victoria Street on Buffalo's East Side for about 3 years. During this time, Gail was also a mother to 4 young children: Kylia, age 9, Amina, age 6, Inez, age 4, and Demario, age 2. One of her Victoria Street neighbors described her as a loving and caring mother. The neighbor stated that Gail kept her children clean, dressed nicely, and their hair was well maintained. The neighbor also said that Gail sent her children to church every Sunday and never bothered anyone. She also said Gail would sit on the porch reading books while her children played outside. Gail had been separated from her estranged husband, Charles Trait, for about 3 years. Now, Charles was the biological father of Gail's 3 youngest children. Her oldest daughter, Kylia, was given the Trait last name, but her father was Joseph Person. In January of 1978, Gail started attending Erie Community College, otherwise known to the locals as ECC, studying nursing. In her anatomy class, it was said that Gail excelled, receiving an A in her studies. Her future as a nurse seemed promising. However, in school, people started to question whether or not Gail was okay because other students had noticed that sometimes Gail would openly cry during class. Now, people in class thought she was crying due to the sensitive nature of the subjects they were discussing. But after July 16, 1978, those same people would question if their assumptions were true. With Gail being the single mother of 4 children, going to school for her nursing degree had to be a lot of work. Gail had become overwhelmed by her responsibilities as a parent and a student. Gail was getting child support for her children, but that money did not go super far for her. So on May 17th of 1978, Gail voluntarily placed her children into foster care. Now, it's important to note that Joseph, Kylia's father, had gotten papers from Erie County Department of Social Services saying that charges had been made against Gail, saying that there was child abuse and neglect. But other reports that I looked at did not mention this at all. They only mentioned that Gail had voluntarily surrendered the children to foster care. The caseworker from Erie County Department of Social Services had contacted Joseph and said that it was best for the children to enter foster care. That way, Gail could have an opportunity to get herself together and really better her life by completing her nursing program. So at that point, Joseph tried to get Kylia, but he was blocked from getting her. He was told that he would not be able to take Kylia because he did not have legal custody of her. He was allegedly told that he would have to get a court order before he could take custody of his daughter, even though she was going into foster care. Now, at this time, Gail was going around saying that she had placed her children into foster care so that she could further her education. And so there's some discrepancy on whether or not she actually voluntarily placed her children into the foster care system or if she was reported as conducting child abuse or some type of neglect. Now, no more than about a month and a half after Gail placed her children into foster care, on July 7th, 1978, she actually reached out to foster care and requested that the children be returned to her. Now, I read that there were a few reasons that Gail may have requested that the children be returned to her. One of the first reasons that I read was that she had lost her social services benefits due to surrendering the children. So, of course, when you get social services benefits, you get them sometimes for yourself, but more likely than not, you will will get them for your children. Now, if you surrender your children to foster care, or if your children are removed from your home and placed maybe with a family member, you will no longer get those benefits because the children are not in the home. So one of the reasons I read that people allege that she requested to have the children back is because she lost her benefits and she wanted access to those benefits again. One of the second reasons that I read that she may have requested to have the children back is that she was going to move to Atlanta and stay with family and basically go to school down there and build a better life for her children in Atlanta. And then one of the third reasons that I read she may have wanted her children back is because family members stated that they would take the children with them to Atlanta while Gail stayed in Buffalo and continued her education at Erie Community College. Almost 2 weeks after getting her children back, on July 15th of 1978, Gail abruptly moved off of Victoria Street, leaving her apartment to move into her mother's apartment at 122 Montana Street on Buffalo's East Side. Nobody was quite sure why Gail had moved. Later on that night, after moving in, she went out with her boyfriend, Ernest Hill. Ernest was a local cab driver in the Buffalo area and had been dating Gail for a bit. They were attending a wedding party for some friends. At the party, Gail had started to engage in what some would call strange talk. Because Gail had been talking what some would deem crazy talk at the wedding reception on July 15th, 1978, the next day her boyfriend Ernest came by to check on her and the children. The first time he visited, Gail refused to let him in. Ernest eventually left, but later on that day he would return again. Ernest just simply couldn't let go of what Gail had been saying the previous night at the party. Now, it was said that he made several attempts to get Gail to open the door and talk to him. I read that he did try for a good period of time to get Gail to open the door, but then he got fed up and he eventually left and did not come back after this second visit. Now, all of this could be heard by Mrs. Louise Peterson, the landlady who owned the home at 122 Montana Street. She lived directly downstairs from Gail's mother. Later on that day, Mrs. Peterson was visited by her neighbor, Lena Jones. Sitting downstairs in the lower unit of the Montana Street house, Lena Jones was conversing with Louise Peterson when she heard what sounded like all hell breaking loose in the unit above where Gail was staying with her mother. At the time, Gail's mother, Dorothy Williams, was not at home. Because the sounds were extremely strange, Lena wanted to go knock on the door of the upstairs apartment to see what was wrong. Mrs. Peterson told Lena not to because it was really none of their business, and reluctantly Lena listened to Mrs. Peterson. According to Lena, the children were screaming and she could hear Gail yelling, "Tell me I'm your mother." Now this went on for some time, and after a while, Lena could not take it anymore, so she went outside to knock on the door that led to the upstairs apartment. By this time, the children were not yelling anymore and things had quieted down. Lena knocked on the door several times, but Gail did not come. Finally, Gail stumbled to the door, flung it open, and exclaimed, "You're not my mother." She was covered from head to toe in blood. Lena stood there in horror. Gail stumbled out of the door and started falling, and Lena tried to catch her, but Gail ended up knocking Lena down and falling on top of her. Lena screamed for Mrs. Peterson to call the police. The police and the ambulance arrived at the scene. The ambulance immediately rushed Gail to ECMC Hospital to attend to her injuries. Inside the ambulance on the way to the hospital, Gail started rambling about a voodoo curse, but the EMTs could not fully make out what she was trying to say. Back at the house, Mrs. Peterson told the police she believed Gail's boyfriend, Ernest, was still up there. She thought he had left, but said she must have been mistaken. Officers at the scene called for detectives to come to the Montana Street location. Leaving the scene of another crime on Jefferson Avenue, police detectives Beher and Rooney made their way to the crime scene on Montana Street. They were joined at the scene by officers Jim Jackson and Steve Evans. All of the officers mounted up and began climbing the narrow stairway single file to the upstairs apartment. Holding their revolvers in hand, the police were careful when they entered the apartment. The television was on in the apartment, but the lights were out, and it cast an eerie glow over the living room as they entered. "Police! Anyone here?" the officers exclaimed as they took their first steps into the dark apartment. It was at this point they saw the gruesome discovery. On the living room floor were two of Gail's children. From what they could see, both had been bludgeoned and were laying in a pool of their own blood. The officer stated the smell of blood was so strong in the apartment it made them sick to their stomachs. After the discovery of the two children in the living room, the officers continued cautiously moving through the apartment. Making their way to the kitchen, the officers would see something even worse than the bodies of the two children laying in the living room. They would see something they would not at all be prepared for and had never seen in their entire careers. The kitchen was covered in blood. There was blood on the floor, and several pots and pans were filled with blood as well. On the table, there were knives, an anatomy book, and even more horrific, they found a container on the table that had a set of eyes in it. After searching the entire apartment and realizing nobody else was there, the police began to assess the scene. Amina and Inez were the children found in the living room, and Amina had been stabbed 63 times. Now, 37 of Amina's 63 stab wounds would be found in her chest area, very close to her heart. She would suffer injuries to her lungs, her jugular vein, and her aorta. Inez had been stabbed 60 times. Now, Kylia and her brother Demario were the children found in the kitchen. Kylia had been stabbed 44 times. Demario had been stabbed several times as well, and in addition to being stabbed several times, Demario's leg had been dismembered at the hip and his hand at the wrist. It was also Demario's eyes who were found in the bowl on the kitchen table. Now, at the hospital staff began to clean Gail up, and that's when they realized that she only had minor scratches. She didn't have any injuries at all to be covered in so much blood. And so that's when they started to make the connection. What was that connection? That Gail had been the perpetrator of the crime the entire time. The next day, when Lena Jones was being interviewed by the police, she was suffering from extreme guilt. She had heard the children screaming and crying, but against her better judgment, she did not go to check on them at the urgings of Mrs. Peterson. Mrs. Peterson told the police that she thought Gail was whooping the children. Lena Jones stated, "I wish I could have done something sooner. If I had done something sooner, I might have been able to save one or two of the children." Now, what nobody knew was that strange talk at the wedding party Gail had attended the night before the murders was where she had started telling her boyfriend Ernest that she was going to kill her children. Other people at the party also heard her say these things. Gail's mother, Dorothy, who had also attended the event, was told by Ernest the things that Gail had been saying. However, Gail's mother blew it off because at the party, she said Gail was acting as she normally did. So essentially, Gail gave some warnings because on her way to the hospital in the ambulance, she had made ramblings that the reason why she committed this crime was because her children had a voodoo curse on them. One of the detectives that arrived at the house first stated that he found some voodoo dolls in the kitchen when they were combing the scene. And according to reports, Gail's estranged husband, Charles, and Joseph, Kylia's father, said that Gail's family practiced voodoo and black magic. On July 20th, 1978, at Mount Ararat Baptist Church on Jefferson Avenue, the funerals for Kylia, Amina, Inez, and Demario were held. It was an exceptionally hot day in Buffalo, and the church was filled with friends, family, and people from the community. Gail was also in attendance. Children, not much older than Gail's older children, sang "Jesus, He Will Fix It," and "I'm going up yonder to be with my Lord" in front of 4 small white caskets. Gail's attorney hired behavioral health specialists to conduct assessments on Gail, and it was determined that Gail was an undiagnosed paranoid schizophrenic. Gail's attorney sought to have her charged with the murders under an insanity plea. However, the prosecution did not buy that Gail was insane. Due to the fact that Gail had talked about the murders ahead of time, they stated that insanity was not the case. They believed that Gail was tired of being a mom and wanted out. Gail's attorney brought up that Gail felt her children had a voodoo curse on them and wanted the voodoo items found at the crime scene admitted into evidence. The reason Gail's attorney was asking for this evidence is because one of the detectives originally at the scene said that voodoo dolls were found in the kitchen. However, officers were now saying that they never found any voodoo items at the crime scene. After her trial, Gail was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison for the slaying of her children. But Gail would only end up serving 10 years of her 25-year sentence before her charges were overturned. While in prison, Gail tried to unalive herself by setting herself on fire. After her sentence was overturned, Gail was sent to a psychiatric hospital where she would stay until 1998 when she was released. I read that she relocated to the Seneca Falls area of New York, which is smack dab in the middle between Buffalo and Syracuse. Buffalo and Syracuse are about 2 hours apart, and Seneca Falls is about an hour away from each of those locations. It was said that Gail was unable to return to Buffalo because it was just way too painful for her. And it also said that she now lives a quiet life and has gotten remarried. This story was extremely interesting to me. For one, it happened in my hometown of Buffalo, New York, not too far from where I live. And for two, as a social worker, knowing that the onset of schizophrenia typically happens, for women at least, in their late 20s to early 30s. And so it really perplexed me that the system failed the children. The system did fail Gail. And it was very unfortunate that these children had to lose their lives in any manner, but especially the way that they did. On the Crime in the Margins podcast, I am going to deep dive into this topic of Gail Trait and do what I like to call the breakdown, where we explore different topics of what could have happened, how the systems failed these people, and how we can possibly change it in the future. Until next time, this is Michelle signing off, and join me for another episode of Crime in the Margins by hitting that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit the bell icon so you are notified every time I upload a video. If you like this video, please be sure to hit the like button, and please be sure to share this video with someone who may find it interesting as well. Bye for now.